You see this juxtaposition between chance and purpose. The two don't have to necessarily be in conflict. God could use chance events for his purposes, just like a casino uses chance events for his or her purposes, right? We don't want to shrink God down to the level of you and I.
Welcome to Purposeful Lab, a Magis Center podcast. I'm Catherine Hadro with Dr. Dan Kuebler, and here we are, start of Season 3, Episode 1. Great to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you again, Catherine. Looking forward to kicking off a new season.
Absolutely. And again, new location for those who are watching and see a different change of scene. So this season, we are delving into biological evolution. Dan, can you give us a preview of what's to come and why we're talking about this now?
Yeah, I think, this season we're going to focus on, biological evolution, this evolutionary process that's played out the last 4 billion years on the planet Earth, and look at that in relation to a couple things. One, what does that mean? Does it have a directionality? Is there a purpose underneath evolution? And then how does that relate to, a Christian understanding of creation? So we'll have some guests on that will look at Genesis. How do you understand Genesis properly, and does that conflict inherently with an understanding of biological evolution? We'll look at the evolution of the human brain and how that affects what it means to be human. We'll look at hominid evolution, which is the evolution of creatures that are more similar to us than, say, chimps. So recent human evolution. Look at what patterns do we see there? What can we glean from that? So those are the sort of topics we're going to sort of focus on, all with trying to understand, does evolution undermine the sense of purpose that we've been talking about on the podcast?
In Episode 1, we're going to kick off laying out the church's position and view on evolution and what it is. Really important kind of framework as we're delving into this, and really no better person to speak about this than you, because you really are this Catholic leading scientist on the topic of evolution. So grateful to dive into this topic with you. Want to just remind our listeners and viewers, so they don't take you for granted, really your credentials on this. You've, again, been a professor of biology at Franciscan University of Steubenville since 2001. You received your doctorate in molecular and cell biology from Berkeley. Currently involved in clinical research, product development, and consulting projects with a variety of biotechnology firms in the regenerative medicine field. But you've also written the book on this. You wrote the book, The Evolution Controversy, a survey of competing theories, and you have a book coming out in 2024 with Word on Fire Press, again, about this topic of the Catholic Church and human evolution.
That's right. And I think that, the book that will be coming out, and a lot of the stuff we're going to talk about this season, so I sort of synthesize my thoughts and thoughts of the church sort of in that book.
Well, if it's all right with you, let's just dive in. Let's dive into this topic. So again, evolution is one of these areas and issues that people have some difficulty, or at least they think they need to have difficulty reconciling their Christian faith. Why do you think this is? How did that begin?
Yeah, I think if you talk to people, hey, what the issues that you see or struggle with to try to reconcile, say, science with faith, and I think evolution is that key issue. I think another issue that comes up is sort of the problem of evil and sin, but within science, is how do I understand, the science of evolution in line with the Catholic understanding of the human person, right? Because it really touches on what it means to be human, right? And the answer to that question affects everything, right? If I am just a material being, a chance conglomerate of molecules, that is going to lead me in different directions about what's the purpose of my life, or is there anything that we can call purpose? But if you argue that you are made in the image and likeness of God, and that is going to change the way you view yourself, the way you view other people, the way you view your actions in the world. So, from a Catholic perspective, to recognize we are made in the image and likeness of God is central to our faith, right? So, but if we're really actually evolved, how do you put those two together? Do you have to choose one or the other? And that's, I think, where this conflict sort of resides, because it fundamentally addresses who we are, right?
Well, I'd love to get, your personal take on this, because as a scientist, you study the biological implications of human evolution. But again, you also are a person of deep faith. So how, for you, do those two perspectives interact? And does your Catholic faith make it easier or more difficult for you to reconcile the two?
Yeah, I think, my Catholic faith certainly helps me reconcile those for a couple of reasons. One, from a Catholic perspective, we always teach the unity of knowledge, that there isn't, the knowledge you get from science over here, the knowledge from philosophy, the knowledge from theology, and they all are discordant and they're conflicting with each other. There's no, from a Catholic view, all the disciplines are converging on one truth. And so that gives me confidence that, okay, when I approach this, that, yeah, it might be difficult. There's going to be questions that are well beyond me that I'm not going to really quite grasp. But I have, this confidence that all truths are leading in one direction and they're all going to converge and that there isn't this inherent conflict. Mm-hmm. Now, the other thing that we want to recognize is that when you look at questions of evolution and creation, right, that instead of saying evolution versus creation, we have to look at evolution, what question is it asking, and how is that different from the questions that creation is asking? So, for example, evolution from a scientific perspective is going to answer specific questions on a specific level, and our understanding of what does it mean to be created is at a different level. And so they're not actually competing for the same sort of on the same level. Well, they can both be correct because they're answering slightly different but related questions because they both deal with the human person.
And do you think that's where the confusion kind of came in? People just confused the two and conflated the two.
Yeah, and we can talk more about that, but I think that people think that if you think you are, created, okay, then therefore you could not have, a human body could not have evolved, right? And people think, well, if evolution can explain the origin of the human body, well then, we weren't created, right? And so there's this either or. And Pope Benedict has written quite a bit about this, and I think I take my lead from him because I think he, more than any other Catholic thinker, has been able to address this fruitfully and clearly.
In modern times as well. What do you say to people who claim, well, doesn't evolution just reduce man to just another animal? Because how do we see man as different from an animal if man also evolved via natural processes?
Right, and I think that gets that question gets to the heart of the matter, right? And so, well, just look at Genesis for a moment, and we're going to have some guests on the next few episodes that talk a lot more about Genesis. But I think I just want to pull one line out of Genesis, and the creation of man, right? And so it's God takes the dust of the earth, right? So there's this material aspect, the dust of creation. Of this material part and breathes life into it, right? So you have the breath of God and this physical stuff, right? So man is a unity of body and spirit, right? And it's that unity which makes us a human person, right? So it is a both and. Right? We're not just the breath of God and we're not just dust, right? We're this unity of the two. So when we step back and we say, well, what can evolution tell us about this reality? If that's our starting point, man is this unity of body and soul, right? And body and spirit. What does evolution do? Evolution, as a scientific theory, right, can explain physical things. Scientific theories are theories about the material world, right? And so we do have a material aspect to our person, right? And so evolution can explain that aspect. But we could not expect evolution to do is explain the entirety of man, right? Because man is more than a physical being. So if we think evolution can explain all of man, we're going to go down the dark alley, right? And that there's something more about the human person. And that is, what Benedict talks about, the creation story in Genesis, is pointing out the truth about man, that we're body and spirit, that we're made in the image and likeness of God. We're made to worship God and so forth. Those truths don't undermine the fact that we share a body that has very similar physiology and evolutionary history with other primates, right? But that doesn't exhaust what it means to be human. Right?
Which that reminds me of something we've talked about before. Science can't answer every single question. And that's why it's important to bring in theology, to bring in philosophy, because there are these big questions that, like you said, we'd get in trouble if we turn to just the material.
Right. Yeah. And there's the idea that, we are just material beings is not something that science can answer. So, it's an open question, and philosophers debate that. Are we just a material being, or do we have an immaterial aspect? Are we body and soul? Science can't answer that question, right? That's not a scientific question. All science can do is explain the proper functioning and proper origin, at least evolutionary origin of that body, of that physical aspect of what it means to be human.
Looking at the history of evolution and the church's view on it, obviously, when you start talking about evolution, one of the pivotal players is Darwin. I think that's a name that most everyone can recognize. And it's a controversial name, it seems like, in faith circles. Darwin, published his work, it was back in 1859. How did the Catholic Church initially respond to his findings and his ideas about science of evolution?
Yeah, it's a really, as with most historical subjects, it's a very complicated and fascinating story. So Darwin was not the first person to put forth evolutionary ideas, but his work, The Origin of Species, the first edition, like you said, came out in 1859, was the best articulation of evolutionary ideas, and he had a sort of a mechanism that might drive evolutionary change. And so there was, a lot of debates amongst Catholics at the time of what to make of this, right? And the interesting thing to me is the church doesn't have any official pronouncement on the theory of evolution for almost 100 years after that. So the church took its time to investigate, what does this mean? How do we reflect on this? First of all, is the science mature enough that we can think that, did man really evolve, right? So first it didn't just jump on board, recklessly, but it also, didn't immediately put up a wall and say, no, this can't be true, right? Now, there were certainly Catholics that said both of those things. They wanted to jump right on board, and others that said, no, this can't be true. Particularly the Jesuits were very adamantly opposed at the time, particularly the ones that ran the Vatican newspaper were adamantly opposed to evolution. But there were those that, like Cardinal John Henry Newman, who thought, there's nothing antithetical to the faith in the theory of evolution. So there was a lot of people in the 1800s that took different views. And so it was, a time in which a lot of sort of questions were raised and details were sort of tried to work out, try to understand, because there was a lot going on in terms of just understanding the science of evolution at the time. But also that was being refined. So was the theology as well.
But the church, like you said, didn't rush, a statement. It seems like took the time to discern and listen. And it does seem in more recent years that recent popes have made statements discussing the topic of evolution. What are the key points that people should know about what the recent popes have said?
Yeah, I think, particularly if you look at Pope Benedict and Pope John Paul II, what have they said about evolution? And they are both very much open to the science of evolution, right? Pope John Paul II, had this famous letter to scientists where he said that evolution is more than a hypothesis, that, there's strong converging evidence from a lot of different fields that, evolution is a well-supported, at least a theory, a scientific theory. But every document and every time a pope talks about evolution, one of the things that they always caution against is that evolution cannot explain the totality of man. So evolution is not going to explain the origin of the human soul. And the immaterial aspect of man, right? So if you were to say, what is the church's position on the science of evolution? The church doesn't have a position on that because the church is not a scientific body, right? So the church doesn't have a position on cell theory and, quantum theory and so forth. That's not, what the church does. It regards, the doctrine and faith and morals, right? But what it does do, and it has to, speak into the culture and say, look, if you start to argue that evolution can explain the totality of man, that is now a philosophy. That goes beyond the science, and it warns against that. So Benedict does, Pope Francis does, Pope John Paul II in particular did. So that is sort of the key point, that evolution is science cannot explain the totality of man, even if the science of evolution and the origin of the human body, it can be explained via sort of natural evolutionary processes.
But they're not in conflict with one another. And, like we've been discussing, there are people, though, who believe that there's conflict between the faith and biological evolution. And there's a few common questions. So I thought it'd be helpful if we tackle some of those top questions people have on this in particular. So, for example, again, evolution seems to be driven by chance mutations and chance events. So if humans are the result of chance, doesn't that conflict with the notion that we talk about a lot here, that humans are planned and willed by God?
Yeah, no, that's a common question. I get that from my students a lot. They see this juxtaposition between chance and purpose, right? Yeah. So clearly there's chance environmental changes that can affect the direction of evolution. There's chance and genetic changes that occur that could affect the direction of evolution. So therefore, God could have never planned us from the beginning, that there's no purpose. We're just here because of some lucky throw of the dice, right? Mm-hmm. Now, first thing to recognize is that just on a philosophical level, the chance and purpose are not juxtaposed. They're not opposites, right? So you can have chance events that you can use for a purpose, right? And so, casinos use chance events for a purpose to make lots of money off people, right? So that is doesn't the two don't have to necessarily be in conflict. God could use chance purposes or chance events for his purposes, just like a casino uses chance events for his or her purposes, right? The second thing, and this is sort of a philosophical point, that we don't want to shrink God down to the level of you and I, right? So God is the primary cause of everything that exists in the universe. So you often see, people say, well, if we can explain it via science, then that removes God from the picture, right? If we can explain something via, my actions, then God had nothing to do with it, right? Now, that is not the Catholic understanding of God's role in the world. God is the primary cause of everything that exists. So anything that happens, whether it happens by human action, by chance events, by the force of gravity, by necessity, happens only because God allows that to happen and sustains that in existence. So Aquinas talks about things that God deems to happen by contingency or chance happen by contingency or chance. Things that happen by necessity, that God deems that happen by necessity. So God allows everything to exist. So just as an example, like this asteroid that hit the U.S. Hit the Yucatan Peninsula about 65 million years ago, which is thought to have led to the extinction of the dinosaurs and then the radiation and a flourishing of mammals and eventually primates. You can say, well, that's a chance event, right? And if that had never hit, the Yucatan Peninsula, humans would have never been here. So clearly, we're just lucky. But from a Catholic perspective, you say, well, God, who created everything and is outside of time, knew from all eternity what every event in the universe, knew the asteroid is, and the asteroid is doing what asteroids do, following what the forces of gravity. The Earth is doing what it does, and they happen to hit, and that chance event was deemed for all eternity by God to do what it was intended to do, right?
And we probably don't even realize when we put, God on our level, quote unquote, right? We probably just naturally impose kind of.
Yeah, we do it all the time. And we do that with everything. We anthropomorphize our dog. Everything. We don't understand how dogs act. We think of them as through the human lens. You think about how God acts. We have no other way but to think through our lens. So we tend to anthropomorphize God, put him down on our level, and bring dogs up to our level, right? Because that's how we think. It's the only sort of way we can think. The other thing that I would point out, though, is that evolution, it's always thought of as a chance, often thought of as just very chancy. But the reality is evolution is built on a bed of order, right? And there's this level of order that's absolutely essential for evolution to work and directs and moves evolution in certain directions. And that's that order, that convergent order that we've talked about back on season 1 with Simon Conway Morris. And this order at the level of physics dictates the way, atoms form, which then dictates how molecules form, which can dictate, the direction of protein evolution and form. So there's a huge amount of order in evolution that I think is more fundamental than these chance events. Right?
Absolutely. One of the issues that people also raised as having difficulty reconciling with evolution is big topic, original sin, and the introduction of death into the world as a result of man's sin, as a result of the fall. So how does death enter the world after human sin if extinction and death are an integral part of the 4 billion year-long evolutionary process? Big question, again, one of these fundamental human questions, but how do you begin to tackle that?
Yeah, I think, and I'm sure we'll discuss this more with some of the guests in the next couple episodes. But the first thing to keep in mind is when you talk about death entering the world, sin and death, those are human categories. Like we're looking at sin is something, you have to have a human person. You have to have a person there to introduce sin. You have to have free choice and have an understanding of that. And the death that's brought in is human death, right? So it's not as if everything was perfect, before a human fall, right? No, there's death, there is, extinction, there's change that's going on throughout the entire cosmic and evolutionary history, right? When the human person comes onto the scene, right? When evolution reaches the point of producing the type of thing that's fitting to have a rational soul, the human person, at that point, that human person is capable of turning away from God and sin. And when that individual does, that allows that person now to be subject to death, right? So it, the church doesn't teach, everything was perfect, and then the fall, and now everything's messed up. In a sense that, the Catechism talks about how the universe is on a journey, and it was in a state of incompletion. We're moving towards perfection, right? And that perfection is in Christ, right? And so this idea of, everything was perfect and the lion lay down with the lamb or whatever is not something that's part and parcel of our Catholic understanding. You think about, in Genesis, just the text, it says, and God created it good. It's good. Creation is good, but it's not perfect, right? It doesn't find its perfection until it culminates in the beatific vision.
We're still on
Christ.
that journey.
Yeah, exactly.
What does, on that same topic, what does the church teach about the fall and Adam and Eve, given that this does seem to contradict the evolutionary form, origin of man?
Yeah, right. So that's one of those big questions that, it's how do you make sense of that, right? It's something that we'll probably never know, right? But it's interesting to speculate on different ideas of that, and that that at certain point, in the evolutionary process, and later on in the season we'll talk about the evolution of hominins, which is a hominid is just any fossil form that's more similar to modern humans than modern chimps. So there was the idea is there was a common ancestor about 7 million years ago, and on one lineage that led to modern humans, another lineage that led to modern chimps. So that hominid forms, we'll talk a little bit about that later on this season. But at some point, that process produces the type of thing that is fitting to have a rational soul. What we say is a human person. It has the matter and form that dust and breath of God that we talked about earlier, that is human and is in relation with God, right? And that there may be sort of a continuity in terms of its biological nature, makeup, but there's a discontinuity there. So it is a both and, because it's transformed with the rational soul into something other, a human person that has the rationality, conceptual thought, the ability of language, all the things that we as humans have that you don't see in, say, other primates, right? And so once you reach that, though, at a certain point, exactly how those first individuals fall or turn away from God and all that, is it's not clear.
Again, questions that we don't have all the answers to at this point. There was a papal document, and you can speak more to this, that came out in 1950 called Humane Generis. And I believe this was the first papal document to mention evolution. And this document seemed to indicate that humans must have originated from an initial pair. So presumably Adam and Eve, is that? So what does that issue pose for science? Is that in conflict?
Yeah, it's an interesting document, and the way Pope Pius worded it in the document, it seems to be, it leaves it open that it's possible it could have happened otherwise. Because in the language, he says, that we're not free to speculate on what he calls polygenism, which in this context means that the humans originated as an initial population. Like, there's a group of 100 first humans, right? Rather than just a single pair of first humans, which would be monogenism. And he says you can't speculate because it's no way apparent. He doesn't say because you can't do that, but he says it's no way apparent how you can reconcile polygenism with the concept of original sin, right? So what's the advantage of thinking of original sin through monogenism? Well, if you have this initial couple, Adam and Eve or whoever, that turn away from God, right? They're now fallen nature. They pass on, their offspring are all inherit this human nature devoid of the preternatural gifts, right? And that's the idea that when humans fall, they lose these preternatural gifts that God has given. So they're left with just what their biology provided them, in a sense, right? Which we all struggle with, right? So
every day.
So you got this initial pair, and then everybody descends from them. So it's very simple, neat, way of original sin being transmitted via generation, right? Now the issue with that biologically is that if you start with two individuals, that's a very small gene pool, right? And so you have to have some sort of incest
Diversity.
going on there, right? And we know from genetic research that, if you have a bottleneck, like the human population went through two individuals, you should see a genetic signature there, right? So if you look at sort of populations of isolated populations that are more inbred, you look at the genetic diversity, and that you can see there's genetic signatures there's a lack of genetic diversity. If you look at the amount of genetic diversity in the modern human population, and a lot of different studies have looked at this, and it seems like the smallest sort of gene pool that it could have come from in the last few million years is probably around 1,000, right? Maybe 10,000 people. So we couldn't have passed through this sort of small come through two individuals and account for the amount of genetic diversity we have. So that's why people say, well, maybe humans originated in an initial population, and then all of those individuals in that population turn away from God and fall, and so then all of their offspring are fallen. So that's there's debate and discussion about that in terms of how do we reconcile the genetic diversity issue with the need for some understanding of original sin that doesn't deviate from church teaching. But again, these are things that people speculate and think about, and it's not clear how they all fit together. And there's people actively working on this idea. Does Adam represent sort of the head of a human family that when he falls, they all follow him, so he leads them over the cliff in a sense, and then the whole population or something. There's different ways that maybe this could be, right? So I don't claim to have all the answers, but I think it's an interesting open question.
And like you said, the church doesn't have one definitive, here's what the scientific belief is.
Exactly. So, okay, well, this is what science seems to say. Well, let's think about this then. What does that mean, It doesn't jump on board and say, okay, we got to throw this away, the idea of monogenism. But okay, well, if that's what science seems to say, let's look at this. Let's investigate this. And that's what, I think, the dialogue between, and Pope Pius mentions this in Humane Generis. He said that there's a need for dialogue between men and women who are learned in theological and philosophical sciences and those that are learned in the biological and evolutionary sciences to dialogue and discuss these and to try to understand each other and understand, the reality of what how these might fit together, right? The idea that there's this unified vision of truth that one truth in science is not going to contradict the truth of theology, and with that, confidence, then we can move forward and freely and investigate these questions. Yeah.
Speaking of the fall and sin and soul, another big question for you: how do the first humans come to even be in the evolutionary process if humans have an immaterial, rational soul?
Right, and this goes back to what what I've mentioned and what we've
Right.
talked about, that the humans have a material aspect. I mean, that's undoubtedly right.
Yeah.
We are material, have a material aspect to ourselves. But does that explain all of the human person, right? And so, the church teaches, and rightly so, that God creates, brings into being the human person at any time a new human person comes into existence. God is creating, because God is creating the immaterial rational soul that comes in. That doesn't evolve. Like my soul doesn't produce another soul, right? No, that comes in me. So in a real sense, God creates each and every one of us in that sense. But at the same time, I co-create with God when I have a child, and so there. In a sense, the evolutionary process co-creates with God. And again, you have to define those terms. But when humans emerge, but God creates the first humans directly, because that a rational soul doesn't evolve. It doesn't come from matter. It is something that's immaterial that informs the matter and transforms it and gives it abilities that the animals don't have.
As we begin to kind of summarize the big ideas and the big takeaways from this topic and the church's understanding of biological evolution, does Genesis, and again, I know we'll speak about Genesis more in depth this season, but does Genesis shed any light on the science of the origin of the first humans?
Yeah, no, I don't. It doesn't necessarily, tell you, tell us how it happened or the material process, but it does help inform what the science should be doing. And I think there's two things that it does, and one I've already hit upon is the idea that the science isn't going to be able to explain everything about man, right? And that focuses our science of what it should do and what it shouldn't do. The other thing that I think is important about the Genesis text that you want to that's to me is amenable to the evolutionary process and scientific understanding. It doesn't explain the science, but it's consistent within the Genesis text. It's not, it says it in Genesis 1 that God said, let the earth bring forth, right? Let the seas bring forth. So he's asking for creation to bring forth and produce things. So God's, in a sense, there's a secondary causality. God's bringing everything into existence, but he's allowing creation to produce things. And that's what the evolutionary process is. Now, that means that the author of Genesis has evolution in mind when this is being written. But it's striking to me that idea of primary and secondary causality is actually in the text itself.
Chapter 1.
Yeah, right. So I think that, I think liberates the sciences. Can we explain how creation could bring forth some of these things, right?
Finally, again, we've talked about it's okay that there are these competing theories when it comes to evolution, and that there are a range of acceptable positions as a Catholic to have on this very topic. Could you summarize what are these competing theories, and how does one identify with which one is the most fitting proposition?
Yeah. I know that's a loaded question, and I'm sure we'll get lots of feedback on this. But in terms of positions, the church doesn't say, to be a good Catholic, you have to believe in 7-day creation story. To be a good Catholic, you have to believe in biological evolution and natural selection, and as being the explanation for the origin of species, right? So there's, anywhere in that range, you can still consider yourself a good Catholic, as long as you are making the claim that with evolution. Evolution only does what it does because God is the primary cause behind it all, and God has intended evolution to do exactly what it's done over the past 4 billion years. So that's the sort of the key, that you can't give that up. You have to hold on, because that's part and parcel of our Catholic understanding of God and God planning us for all eternity. But within that, any of those positions would be considered, an acceptable Catholic position. Mm-hmm. That said, right, the Catholic Church and Pope John Paul II and Fides et Ratio talks about faith and reason, and one aspect of reason is scientific reason. It's not all. There's philosophical reason. There's lots of other, reasons, ways of knowing other rational arguments besides scientific arguments. But we as Catholics, I think, should have a healthy respect for scientific discovery, right? And so we would want to have an understanding of the science, and have a proper understanding of the science integrated into our understanding of creation and evolution. And people can debate back and forth about the science of evolution, and people do this, and there's interminable debates out there. But I think the key point is that we should have a respect for the science, and we should at least look at the scientific data and say, okay, how can we integrate this into, like I said, this idea that God is the primary cause of all things.
I think in examining the science, it really, I don't know, for me at least, puts me more in awe of God and his creation.
Right. And people have said, what's more, miraculous, a God who directly creates things, or a God who creates a creation that can co-create, right? I think there's something about that, the way God works with us. We have our freedom to be able to do certain things. We don't have unlimited freedom, but we have freedom to do what humans do. Creation has freedom to do what creation does within certain contexts, right? And that freedom is only there because God allows that freedom and knows where that freedom is eventually going, right?
If I had to give my big takeaways from what you just shared in this conversation, human evolution cannot explain the totality of man. Science is limited in what it can tell us there, that God is the primary cause of evolution, that chance and purpose are not opposed, and good does not mean perfect. Those are all the things that kind of stood out for me, and honestly are good life lessons as well. Are there final takeaways, final thoughts on this topic of the church's approach to biological evolution?
Yeah, I think the final takeaway is just, be not afraid. That's one of those that the church should not be afraid of science. People in the church should not be afraid of science. What we need to be wary of are those who argue that science has all the truth, that science can explain everything, and we need to oppose those ideas with rational philosophical arguments, because there's very good non-theological rational arguments to say, no, there's certain things that science is not going to be able to answer, and that we have to use philosophy and theology, other things, to answer those questions about purpose and meaning. And that purpose and meaning is not something that is antithetical to an evolutionary understanding of the world. So holding on to an evolutionary understanding of the world doesn't mean I have to give up any notion of purpose and direction.
And might I recommend for our viewers and listeners to read your book on this very topic if they want to learn more and look ahead to the book that's going to come out in 2024. Well, now that you've been in the hot seat on this topic of human evolution, moving on now to some questions for the office hour segment. Okay, so this caught my attention. Recently, you and your lovely wife, Nellie, wrote a joint op-ed in the National Catholic Register, and the title was The Pro-Life Movement's Achilles Heel. And this immediately caught my attention because a lot of my professional work is in the pro-life movement and reporting on the pro-life movement. I was intrigued by this. So why did you write this article, and what was your main argument?
Yeah, well, it's article that we wrote that looks at sort of the pro-life in its totality in marriage, and that was there's openness to life that should be at the heart of a Catholic.
Speaking of Genesis,
right? Yeah, and how I think the contraceptive mentality, right, is something that strikes at the heart of this openness to life. And once you sort of adopt that, where I'm not open to the other, I'm fully open to the other, it doesn't mean have as many kids as possible, but no, being responsible, but being open to life, can lead one slowly to say, well, I need to have abortion, even though it needs to be rare, but I need to have that as sort of back, because I don't want to be fully open to life. I want it on my terms. And I think the contraceptive mentality is something that can work against even people who claim to be pro-life. If that mentality seeps in, it can be problematic.
Okay, moving on now to the second question. This is a question that was submitted and really gets to the heart of what our discussions are about here at the podcast. So how do you answer this question? Prove to me that purpose exists in the natural world.
So it does, and it's exactly the question that we've been after, right? And so the question is prove. What do you mean by that, right? Because scientifically you cannot prove that, right? Like it's not something that is a scientific question that there's purpose. Science can measure the force of the heartbeat and so forth and things like that. But if you say, what's the purpose of this ecosystem? What's the purpose of humans? That is something that goes beyond the science, and that goes towards the nature of the thing. So if you look at things, do they act towards an end? Right? Is there an order that things have in the natural world? And this is something we'll talk about with some future guests. But say just the developmental process. There's a directionality and order during development as the organism matures to get to an end, a goal, right? There's a purpose there. There's a purpose in the seasons. There's a purpose in the way in which organisms operate for survival or reproduction and so forth. And so this order and directionality that you see not only in individual organisms, but you see it in ecosystems, you see it in human life, right? All sort of demonstrate that there is a purpose to what we see here, right? And the other thing that I think demonstrates this is that purpose is hardwired into us, right? And that people and we see this in psychological studies, that the people don't see a purpose or a meaning in their lives, that their mental health goes off the deep end. So there's something about us, we're having purpose and having meaning is hardwired into us for our flourishing, which suggests, that is something that we're meant to do. We're meant to find a purpose. We're meant to find something greater than ourselves to strive for, and to operate towards.
I think that's a perfect note to end this episode on as we launch season 3. I want to remind our listeners and viewers that you can submit questions right here for office hours to hear Dr. Kuebler answer. You can email your questions at info@majacenter.com. You can also give us a call, leave a voicemail. We can listen to your voice here on the podcast. Go ahead and call 949-257-2436. Leave us a question. Give Dr. Kuebler a hard one to tackle. But that does it for this episode. Make sure to subscribe to your favorite podcast platform and go to majacenter.com for the latest updates. We'll see you next time.